All right, guys, we are now live for another weekly episode of Nomberg Law Live. I want to welcome everybody as we do each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Central. Interesting conversations with people in their areas of expertise. And we certainly are there this week as well. I want to welcome Dr. David Hughes at Auburn University, Montgomery, the Political Science Department. Thank you, David, for having some time for us today.
No, I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
The title of our talk today is Why Voting in Alabama Matters. And David has been studying this for many years. And before we really jump into the deep end, David, tell folks a little bit more about yourself personally and professionally, and then we'll get started.
Sure. Well, I'm from Alabama. I grew up in St. Clair County. My folks are from Birmingham. I went to the University of Montevallo and got my bachelor's degree in political science and history. And then afterward, I went to the University of Georgia and got my PhD in political science and the politics of the judiciary. I joined the political science department at Auburn University at Montgomery in 2016, and I've been there ever since, mostly teaching courses on courts, American politics, and some statistics, including some recent efforts that we've taken to poll Alabama politics. So now I'm involved in polling the state's attitudes on issues like state elections and public policies.
Well, with just a week remaining, a week from today, from some have said the most important presidential election of our lifetime. I'm sure that's been said in the past, but we must be right in your wheelhouse, right in your heyday right now. Is this the most fun time of the year for you, or the least fun, or how do you describe it for you?
No, professionally, it is fun. It's not often that Alabama politics gain national attention unless it's for something that something bad that we've done. And so it is fun in the sense that our politics are relevant to national politics, and so some of the issues facing Alabama voters draws attention from the national press, and people want to know what are Alabama politics like, and how do Alabama voters engage in elections, and what are their values, and what are we likely to do, and how's that going to affect national politics.
And I do want to touch on that, but I want you, if you would, David, just for a couple of minutes, give us a brief history of Alabama politics as a whole, kind of a bird's eye view. I know we've had a lot of characters. We've also had a lot of strong feelings over the decades in the South, in the Bible Belt, if you will. But how has Alabama politics looked historically, and then coming up to the current?
Yeah, so one of the consistent threads in Alabama politics is that we do have these sorts of wild characters, and one of the reasons that we see this, particularly in southern states, is that historically we've been a one-party state, and so when everybody belongs to the same political party, the value of a party label means less. So how do you get elected when everybody's a Republican or when everybody's a Democrat? You have to stand out somehow. And so, this has been a consistent theme for Alabama since we've been a one-party state. And we've been a one-party state roughly since 1875, following the end of Reconstruction. From 1875 up until the 2000s, we were one-party democracy with a big D. And since roughly 2010, we've been a one-party Republican state. There was a brief interlude of two-party competition between roughly 1986 and roughly 2002, when statewide elections were fought on kind of an even basis between the Republicans and the Democrats. But it has been that one-party theme which has animated so much of our politics. It's what tends to keep voter participation in elections down. It's what also tends to breed corruption. Alabama's been well known for its political corruption. When there's no viable out party, there are few incentives to provide good government because voters are unlikely to hold you accountable. We have seen, however, in the last few years, Alabama voters more willing to hold politicians accountable. I would point to the defeat of Luther Strange as being a prime example of that.
Mhm.
Granted, it happened in the primaries. It was Republican voters who held Luther Strange accountable for what was widely perceived to have been a corrupt bargain with, the resigned and disgraced former governor Robert Bentley. And then there was a sense of accountability in the sense that the Republicans nominated someone who turned out to be an extremely flawed candidate in Roy Moore, leading to the first Democratic senator in Alabama's history in 25 years since
David,
1990.
I was going to say some of those names that you're putting out right now in the last decade alone have created national news. And this is not the kind of national news that Alabama wants to be known for. But I do want to kind of shift for just a second. I think you said in 1986 through the early 2000s, there was a shift in voting and what was going on in our state. I would take us back to that time period for just a minute. What was going on in the mid 80s that led to that?
Well, the Democratic coalition that had governed Alabama since the 1870s was falling apart. And this was largely due to the enactment of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Once the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, Black voter registration in the state soared. Before 1965, the percent of eligible African Americans registered to vote was in the teens. By 1966, that number was closer to 60%. So it was a huge swell in Alabama's voter rolls. And, that's one of the reasons why Alabama had always been so predominantly one-party Democratic, was that, it was fraudulently achieved through voter suppression. Once African Americans started joining the electorate across the country, whereas in the 1870s, during Reconstruction, African Americans overwhelmingly joined the Republican Party. By the 1960s, when African Americans joined the electorate, they overwhelmingly joined the Democratic Party. And this had an effect across the South, which was that conservative whites who had, wanted to maintain institutions like segregation, began to flee the Democratic Party and instead invested their time and their resources in what had always been a moribund institution in the Republican Party. So it was a gradual process between the 1960s and the 1990s across the South. Whites were gradually moving away from the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party. And by the 1980s, enough people had changed parties in order to make the Republican Party in the South competitive. And we see that in 1986 in Alabama. 1986 was the first election in a long time when George Wallace wasn't going to run. And Wallace's coalition, when he ran for the last time in 82, was dramatically different from when he had run, say, back in 1962. By the 1980s, he actually had to court Black voters in order to win the Democratic primary, in order to win the governorship one last time. And in the 80s, the Democrats who succeeded him tried to replicate what he had done, building a coalition of union members, teachers. The AEA was a huge component of Alabama's Democratic coalition, Black voters, and they were still trying to win over rural voters, that had always kind of been Wallace's coalition. But by that point, Republicans had really gotten their ground game together. They were taking advantage of the Reagan Revolution of the 80s, and they were getting more middle-class whites, more suburbanites, those with a college education. And that was the first time we get a Republican governor elected since, 1872 or something.
Yeah, over 100 years.
Yeah. And so between 1986 and 2002, the Democrats and Republicans kind of switched back and forth between the governorship. You get a Republican one year, a Democrat the next. And then by 2002, you get Siegelman versus Riley, which was an incredibly close election. Siegelman, I saw him post on Twitter recently. He's still claiming that they stole it from him.
I did see that.
But that was the death knell of Democratic politics for that era. Democrats held on to the legislature because of gerrymandering up through 2010. But in 2010, Republicans took it all. So that's kind of where we've been since then. I kind of bookend the period of two-party politics in Alabama, the 86 election up to the 2002 election.
and then strongly in the last decade in Alabama. It really doesn't appear to have been a very close at all in the way Alabama votes.
No, you
What's
look at
your
the
take for the last few years?
yeah, you look at the 2016 election, and it was the worst showing for a Democratic candidate in Hillary Clinton, I believe, in the history of Democratic politics, going all the way back to the 1830s. I want to say she got something like 35% of the state vote. It's just utterly terrible showing. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that she wasn't Barack Obama. Barack Obama did pretty well in Alabama in 2008 and 2012, in the sense that he outperformed most Democrats running a statewide election. But the Democrats really just absolutely fell apart after 2010. You could chalk a lot of that up to state leadership. You got folks who are running the party like Joe Reed and Worley, who really weren't interested in building a statewide coalition that could compete on an even footing with the Republicans. They seemed perfectly content not to run a statewide organization. But I have seen, since they were ousted by the DNC and replaced by folks like Chris England, the Democratic representative from Tuscaloosa, a much more competent organization. I don't expect them to start winning statewide elections. That will take years.
That's what I was just getting ready to ask you. With the change in leadership, has there even begun any momentum?
Yes,
for the Democrats.
Yes, and Doug Jones can really be credited for that. When he ran in 2017, he did it without the party's help. He basically had to build his own political party to raise money, to cut TV ads, to fundraise. He really had no help at all, but he gave a new generation of Democrats hope that maybe Democratic politics could have a place in a state like Alabama, because we're looking around and our neighbors like Georgia and Florida, North Carolina, to a lesser extent Texas, we're beginning to see the reemergence of two-party politics in these states. Alabama's not one of them. And part of that has to do with the fact that we're a stagnant state. Nobody's coming to Alabama. There aren't investments in Alabama, not like Georgia, not like Atlanta, not like Chapel Hill, Raleigh, not like Houston. And so it's that sense of we kind of feel, younger voters feel stuck in the politics of Alabama 30 years ago.
Well, let me pause you for just a second. There's one of my favorite books is by a Southern author from Birmingham, Paul Hemphill. He wrote Leaving Birmingham, and it was his experience growing up in the Inslee community. And then he ultimately moved to Atlanta, and he explains a little bit of the history of the city of Birmingham, the history of Atlanta from his perspective, and why Birmingham remained, and my term, stagnant, and Atlanta flourished.
Yep.
And this goes back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s coming forward. Mr. Hemphill sadly is no longer with us, and he wrote this book over 20 years ago, but I think I've reread it 4 or 5 times. And the theme that I always see, and this is to your point, is Birmingham hasn't progressed like Atlanta. And I think the leaders at that time, that's what they wanted. They didn't want to develop into a regional powerhouse of a city.
Yeah, if you look back, and the two cities make for a fascinating case study in what can change in a short period of time, a relatively short period of time. Back in the 50s and the 40s, Birmingham was the bigger city. And it was largely viewed as being sort of the capital of the South. But it really was the difference in leadership, the vision that leaders had in the two cities that really put Atlanta on the track to become a major powerhouse, a major economic and cultural powerhouse in the South. And Birmingham got put on. I grew up in the Birmingham area. The neighborhood that my parents came from in the Woodlawn area, it's only just now starting to come back.
Right. I live 2 neighborhoods over. I'm in Forest Park, and I go through Woodlawn quite a bit. And you see pockets of it starting to build up a little bit.
And and so like Avondale, that's changed so much since I was a kid.
Mhm.
And it seems to gradually be moving out from from Avondale. But Atlanta was also perfectly willing to play off of Birmingham's weaknesses in order to attract business, because Birmingham was one of the few major southern cities controlled by segregationists.
Mhm.
Folks like Bull Connor. Most major southern cities were controlled by moderates, people who were willing to go along with desegregation orders, so long as it didn't mean that their schools got closed down or businesses didn't leave. Not Birmingham.
Right.
Birmingham was going to fight tooth and nail. And so, you get the pictures of the dogs and the fire hoses. And leaders in Atlanta would basically court big business and say, I know you're considering Birmingham, but do you have black employees? Do you think they'd want to move to a place like Birmingham, Birmingham?
Mhm.
Um, and that was really the key difference, is that Atlanta had much more competent leadership at that time, and Birmingham decided to cut off its nose to spite its face.
Yeah, I've have been fortunate to have so many civic leaders on my show over the years, those who've lived the life in those parts of Birmingham that were so dramatically impacted. We've had so many of those conversations. But for those of you just joining me, Dr. David Hughes with AUM, political scientist. We're talking about the Alabama, a little bit of Alabama history of voting. But I want to come forward, David. We've got one of the most intriguing races, to me at least, is Senator Doug Jones against a former football coach. And I want you to, I think I know what you're going to tell me, but where do you see the numbers right now? I want to talk about the current elections nationally and statewide, as well as a little bit of the amendments. Um, I don't know. I get a little depressed every once in a while when I think about these things. So tell me what's what.
Um, so what I tell most folks who are asking about this election is, you got to keep in mind, in any given statewide election, roughly 60 to 65% of the electorate is Republican. Roughly 35 to 40% of the electorate are Democrats. If a Democrat is going to win a statewide election, they've got around a 20-point hill they need to climb in order to outperform the typical Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
I have no doubt Doug Jones is going to outperform the typical Democrat. But the gap he needs to close in order to win a statewide election is so big, I'm fundamentally skeptical that he can close it. He has uh, put together one of the most competent Democratic campaigns I've seen in Alabama in a long, long time. And he's done a really good job to position himself as a moderate, a moderate that would appeal to, generally speaking, we're talking more affluent whites, because that's really the challenge that any Democrat running in Alabama has. I hear national pundits talking about the importance of, particularly African American women, to Doug Jones's victory in 2017, and what an important aspect of his coalition those voters are. And that's absolutely right. They are the bedrock of his coalition. But in order to win a statewide election, he's going to win around 95% of black women's votes, and he's going to win close to 90% of black voters overall. But that's only 26% of Alabama. Mm-hmm. He's got to persuade white voters to vote for him. Mm-hmm. And there are persuadable white voters in Alabama who typically vote Republican. They typically have college degrees. They tend to live in urban or suburban areas. And that's why I say Doug Jones will almost certainly outperform the typical Democrat running in Alabama, because he's made friends with that moderate aspect of the electorate. But the polling that I've done so far still suggests that there's a gap, and it's a tough gap to overcome. So the last poll that we did showed Biden trailing Trump in Alabama by 20 points, which is exactly what happened in the 2018 gubernatorial election. Maddox lost to Ivey by 20 points. And that was a great showing for Democrats in that election, because you look at the previous two gubernatorial elections, Democrats were getting like 35% of the vote, just, really tough numbers. So we showed Biden trailing Trump in Alabama by 20 points, but we showed Jones trailing Tuberville by 12. So that's a big improvement over the typical Democrat running in Alabama. But it really just goes to my broader point, which is that there's a really big hill to climb. Clinton lost to Trump by like 25 or so points. And we expect turnout to be really, really high this.
That's what I was just getting ready to ask you. I saw something last night before I went to bed that nationally we're on pace to have more early voting ballots in than ever before. I don't know what, maybe 60 plus million, I think, where we're headed. And
Yeah.
what does that indicate nationally? What does that indicate in our state?
Nationally, I think we're on pace to have a once in a century turnout election. 2018 was a signal that 2020 was going to be a huge turnout. In 2018, that was a once in a century turnout for a midterm election. And there was a little bit of speculation back in the spring about, COVID-19 could put the brakes on turnout, but all signs suggest COVID-19 is not putting the brakes on turnout. So, yeah, I was looking at returns yesterday, and in Texas, the number of people who have already voted is roughly 85% of the number who voted in total in 2016.
Wow.
So that's just an insane amount of turnout. Not in Alabama, though. The number of absentee ballots that have been returned already is still fewer than, I think, 10% of the number who voted in 2016. So Alabama, yeah, we're going to have more turnout than we did in 16. I feel pretty confident about that. And it could also beat 2008, which was the record in terms of the percent of eligible voters. The Secretary of State's office would say, well, in 2016, more votes were cast, but that's really not the right way to look at it. You need to look at them as a percentage, as a rate, because we have grown a little bit over the past, 15 or so years.
From a population standpoint,
yeah,
of eligible voters.
Yeah, from a population standpoint. So I feel pretty confident that we're going to set a turnout record. I just don't think it's going to be quite as stark as what we're going to see in states that are expected to be competitive. Georgia, turnout's going to be massive. Texas will be massive. Florida, it'll be massive. Alabama, it'll be big. I just don't think it'll be totally off the charts big.
Well, David, historically, what has that indicated? Why such a large early voting numbers? What is that showing? Is this first time voters? Is this young voters? Is it just people doing a better job of PR, if you will, about getting out people to vote?
Yeah, a lot of what we're seeing from states, especially Texas, is first time younger voters are participating. We can expect participation among younger voters to be much higher this year compared to the average year. And that's only going to benefit Democrats. Younger voters are overwhelming.
I was just getting ready to ask you, does the younger generation favor more Democrat than it does Republican?
Even in Alabama, our polling suggests that among voters who are between 18 and 34, there are more Democrats than Republicans. Mm-hmm. And that's a trend pretty much across the board in the United States. It's not as stark in Alabama as it is elsewhere. In other places, you can think of a place like New York, Massachusetts, California. It's just, we're talking margins of like 4 or 5 to 1 mm-hmm. of Democrats to Republicans among millennials and Gen Z voters, especially Gen Z voters. Once Gen Z voters really begin registering to vote and participating, it's really going to be difficult for Republicans to be competitive. And, let's be perfectly honest, Republicans haven't been very competitive at the national level for a while. Mm-hmm. We can go back and look at every presidential election since 1992. Republicans have only won a plurality of the votes one time. It's only
in 28 years.
And that was 2004. And that was because we just invaded another country, or two countries. Yeah. So it's really only America's odd electoral institutions vis-a-vis the Senate and the Electoral College that allows Republicans to sort of artificially compete as a viable mm-hmm. National party. They are extremely competitive at the local level in most states. Mm-hmm. But nationally, no, Republicans really haven't been competitive in a long time. It's really just America's electoral institutions that give them the the image of being competitive.
Sure. Well, David, let me pause you and ask you. Let's bring it back to Alabama for our last couple of minutes.
Sure.
If I'm someone who is just, I'm not typically involved in voting and politics. All of it just doesn't matter to me. I'm in my own little world. But then you have a conversation with this person, and I want to tell them why voting in our state matters. And I want to hear from you a little bit of what's my argument there. I want to be able to convince, I don't care which way you vote, you need to vote. Why does that matter in our state?
Too many people have bled and died for you to have the right to vote. And it's a bit too cynical for my taste for people to say that it's a trivial process. Historically, Alabama's politicians didn't want a democracy. They wanted rule for an elite set of interests. And for most of Alabama's histories, they've had it. And that's largely because eligible voters, don't participate and hold them to account. I tell my students this all the time. States tend to get the government that they deserve. And if you want better government, you've got to participate in the process and hold politicians to account. Alabama voters have a lot in common across the political divide. Poor voters in particularly have far more in common with each other. Democrat, Republican, Black, white, than the policies that tend to divide them that our politicians want to highlight. The only way that we get government to be representative, the only way we get transparency in government, the only way we get accountable government is if voters exercise the franchise and not take it for granted.
I hope that with the onslaught of social media, of radio, TV, whatever, which is always in our face 24 hours a day if you allow it, it can be a real turnoff sometimes because it can be overwhelming. Because when you see all of these ads, which one party attacks the other party, et cetera, it's extremely rare where I saw where the two candidates in Utah for governor actually had a joint commercial. Have you seen one of those previously?
That's fascinating. I've never seen that.
Well, it's I just saw it earlier this past week. It's the two candidates, and it was really eye-opening. I'm sure it's gotten tons and tons of play. But my point being is, I just hope that those people who have decided or haven't decided whether they're going to vote will understand what you just said, why it's so important to get out and cast your ability to make change or to do what you think is best. And David, before we get out of here, and I sure appreciate your historical perspective, your expertise in breaking this down, we've got some statewide amendments as well. When I say statewide, they're from all over the state. And there's, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 of them. And not to get too bogged down in them, but if I'm in Jefferson County, why do I care about amendments in other parts of the state? Why should I vote one way or the other?
Yeah, it's a tough one. That's a relic of our Jim Crow Constitution. Mm-hmm. And arguably, if you're in Jefferson County, maybe you shouldn't care so much about what's going on, say, in Montgomery County, or maybe you shouldn't have a vote on what goes on. And
that's always been something of curiosity to me, but go ahead.
I don't know that I have a really sound piece of advice for you. On the one hand, you could cast your ballot in the way that you think that Montgomery ought to be governed, or you could cast your ballot in a way that you think that folks who live in Montgomery ought to be governed, or prefer to be governed. Or you could simply leave that provision blank and say, well, that's up to the folks in Montgomery.
Well, that's what I was just getting ready to ask you. When you get the ballot, if you go into the polling place in your community where you're registered and you get the ballot, if you've never seen one before, it can be overwhelming.
It can.
And so I was going to ask you, I was going to ask you what, for somebody who's never voted before, what would you tell them other than bringing your photo ID? How do you approach this before you go or when you get there?
So the Secretary of State's office provides sample ballots for every county in the state. I'd recommend first going and seeing what the ballot looks like before you go into your polling place. And then I would also encourage you to try and get a layman's interpretation of what these ballot items mean. And so a nonpartisan website like Ballotpedia can be a useful place for nonpartisan information that explains what some of these ballot items are actually about, because politicians do have a tendency to word these things in legalese that the every person might have a difficult time understanding. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I would encourage folks to do is be prepared to know what's on the ballot, and then just do 5 minutes worth of research on a nonpartisan website to give you sort of a layperson's interpretation of what these ballot items are about.
Yeah, take some of that stress of voting out. Be prepared a little bit before you go in. Have a plan.
And frankly, if things turn out the way I expect them to, you'll probably stand in line for a little while on election day. So take your phone and look it up in line. You'll have some free time.
Yeah, build in a little extra time. But David, thank you so much for spending some time with us, giving us a little historical perspective of the state and what you're seeing these days. So I really appreciate your information today.
I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And guys, as I said at the beginning of the show, and I say it every week, interesting conversations with people in their areas of expertise. And Dr. David Hughes with AUM really broke it down for us a little bit and just helped to explain a lot what's going on in politics. Thank you again, guys, for your active participation, watching either whether it's live or later on. Hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Next week when we come to you, it'll be election day and we'll have another good conversation. You guys take care.